Hey all, this is Steph Giordano with Human Services Research Institute, or HSRI. This is our third video to review the background information section of the adult in-person survey for the 2017-18 data collection cycle. Here we are going to take a look at the second half of the background information section, and again just do a little bit more of a detailed look at some of the questions. I'll talk about the intent, give some explanation and definitions where it's applicable. Alright, so we're going to kick it off here with the employment and other daily activities section. So for those of you who have done NCI data collection in the past, you're going to notice some slight changes to this grid this year as opposed to previous years. Same as in previous years, however, we are looking for information based on a typical 2-week period. So this is really important. What we're looking for here is what the most standard 2 weeks looks like for this individual. So if the person happened to be on vacation or perhaps sick for the past week or two when you're collecting this information, we don't want to necessarily capture what those 2 weeks look like, but really look at the most standard typical 2 weeks for the individual. For each activity we ask about, we want to know, of course, whether the person takes part in the activity, and if so, how often or how many hours they spend during those 2 weeks doing this activity. When applicable, we're going to find out about wages, whether the person gets publicly funded services or supports to take part in the activity, and again, if applicable, we want to know whether an activity is done primarily by a group of people with disabilities. So we start with question BI 43, which is your typical job in the labor market, so competitive employment. This is a person who's working in an individual job at a business in the community alongside peers who do not have disabilities. So if a person is in this type of paid community job, we want to know how many hours the person typically spends during 2 weeks doing this work. And question C is where, for those of you who are more familiar with the survey, we'll see a bit of a difference this year. We're asking about hourly wages. So in a typical 2-week period, what is the person's hourly wage for their paid individual community-based job? We also want to know whether the person gets publicly funded services or supports to take part in this activity. BI 44 is also about a job done in a community-based setting, but this is a small group job. So it's an activity that's done around people without disabilities, but as part of a group of not more than 8 people with a disability. So this can be something like an enclave or a work crew. We again want to know number of hours typically spent during the 2-week period, what are the hourly wages, and whether the person gets publicly funded services or supports to participate in this work. Question BI 45 is about unpaid activities in a community-based setting, so this can be things like volunteering, skills training, or community supports. If the person is in an unpaid community activity or takes part in this kind of activity over the typical 2 weeks, we want to know how many hours they typically spend doing this activity, whether they get those publicly funded services and supports, and if the activity is done primarily by a group of people with disabilities. So question BI 46 here is new this year. This is about paid work in a community business that primarily hires people with disabilities. Oftentimes this will be an employment setting that is run by a provider agency. But what we're looking for here is that employees who have disabilities are interacting with people who are who do not have disabilities. But it's not a job that is in a traditional sheltered workshop, and it's not an enclave. So it again is something that is out in the community. It may be that the person is working in a type of setting such as a bakery, a car wash, or thrift store. Again, most of the employees would have disabilities. However, they're interacting on a daily basis with the general population. If people are in this type of paid work, we want to know, again, typical hours spent over a course of 2 weeks, hourly wage, whether the person is getting publicly funded supports. The next couple of questions are around work that is done in a facility-based setting. So BI 47 is paid work in a facility-based setting. So this could be a traditional workshop or activity center, but really exclusively for people with disabilities. For this question here, we are going to look for the number of hours that the person typically spends doing this activity or getting paid for the activity. Rather than look at hourly wage here, though, we are looking for typical wages earned, so the gross wages earned in a typical 2-week period. That's because we know oftentimes that in these types of settings, people may be getting a piece rate, and so it's kind of difficult, or oftentimes can be difficult, to figure out what the hourly wage would actually be. Question 48 is unpaid activities done in a facility-based setting, so it could be day habilitation, senior program, or drop-in center. For this question, aside from wanting to know whether the person takes part in the activity, we just want to know the number of hours spent in a typical 2-week period doing this activity. So where this grid gets a little extra complicated is that we're really looking for you all to try and parse out the typical 2 weeks for the individual. So what this means is that we really want to be sure that we're capturing all of the things that people do during the 2-week period. And we know that oftentimes that is not regulated to just one of these questions. And so often you'll be filling out information that the person is doing some kind of job, as well as maybe an unpaid community activity, but also maybe paid or unpaid work in a facility-based setting. And so we want to capture all of that information as accurately as possible and really record only the hours the person is spending doing each of those activities and the wages that they're earning as part of those specific activities. Where this gets a little extra complicated is that sometimes we find that the person may, for instance, be going to a day program or sheltered workshop during the day. So we would perhaps check off BI 48 for a typical 2-week period. But as part of that day program, they're perhaps going and doing a small group job in the community. Let's say that they're cleaning a park. So if that's the case, we would check off that the person is going to an unpaid activity for their day program. We record the number of hours they're spending in that day program for the typical 2 weeks, and then separately record those hours that they're spending doing that small group job in question BI 44. So we would want to record the number of hours and those wages that they're earning just during those times that they're out in the community doing that job. We do recognize that this is information that can be really difficult to collect, and that parsing through that information takes some time and effort, but it is information that is so vital for states to be able to have and collect and be as accurate as possible. So we have a few more questions here around employment. So whether community employment is a goal in the person's service plan. We do want to know if the person is enrolled in school, and this could be high school, vocational, or certificate program, if they're in college, or perhaps you're unsure. For individuals who are in paid community employment, we want to know whether they receive paid time off, so it's vacation, holiday, or sick time, and how long the person has been at their current job. We want to know if the person is self-employed, and then separately, what type of job the person has. BI 55 asks about other services and supports the person receives. This is another one where we have a no, yes, and don't know for each option here. It's really, really important, again, that we do have a no, yes, or don't know checked off for each of these response options, again, so that we know how best to analyze this question for data reporting purposes. We ask about the source of funding for services and supports that the person receives. Often in states, only one or perhaps two of these funding sources will be applicable, and so you can get in contact with your NCI coordinator if you want some or need some additional information on this question. BI 57 asks whether the person receives Medicare, and BI 58 is about whether the person is using self-directed supports. For those who are self-directing, we want to know who employs the person's support workers. And finally, we ask about behavioral support needs. So this is whether the person needs extensive, some, or no support for self-injurious, disruptive, and destructive behavior. And for each of these behavior types, we do give a little bit of a definition about what we are looking for in terms of what the behavior means or how it's defined. Finally, for question BI63, we want to know the sources of information for background collection for this information. So whether you're getting all of this information from case management records, from provider records, a database, either from the state or a state Medicaid agency, if you are speaking directly to the individual or family member, or if there's some other combination of information. And this is information that, again, it's helpful for the state to know where all this information is coming from. It's also information that's helpful on a national level to better understand where all of this information comes from. So that takes us to the end of this review of the pre-survey background information for the adult in-person survey for the 2017-18 data collection cycle. Thank you all so much for listening to these modules, and please do always feel free to get in contact with any questions that you may have about the survey. Thanks so much. Bye.